Those are the two halves of the book of Exodus. And then I've divided the rest of it up into 10 very simple portions and given them each a title, because I can memorize things that are simple. And there are 6 sections in chapters 1 to 18 and 4 in chapters 19 to 40. And running through them, the 6 sections in the first half I've called multiplication and murder. That covers the incredible increase in the number of Hebrew slaves over 400 years, from one family to 2.5 million. That's some increase. Actually, it would only need 4 children in each generation for 30 generations, and you can do it mathematically. So it wasn't all that multiplication, but they certainly became a huge number. And then, of course, the boys were murdered by the Pharaoh. We'll look at all these in detail later. Bulrushes and bush, you all know the story of how Moses was taken out of the bulrushes, and therefore given the name Moshe, which means drawn out, because he was drawn out of the river Nile. The baby boys, of course, were thrown into the river Nile to the crocodiles. But Moses was drawn out of the river Nile. Plague and pestilence, well, that centers on Pharaoh and the hardness of his heart. Feast and firstborn, that's the origin of the Passover. We'll look at that in greater detail. Delivered and drowned is the crossing of the Red Sea, but they weren't drowned, but the Egyptian army was. Provided and protected talks about their journey from Egypt to Sinai and some of the things that happened, how God protected them and provided for them. In a wilderness where the Egyptian army in the Yom Kippur War was perishing after 3 days. And yet 2.5 million people survived for 40 years. Again, God had to do a lot of miracles. In the second half, we have first of all the commandments, and especially the 10 commandments. And these were sealed in a covenant, a marriage between God and his people. And God said, I will, and they said, we will. And that bound them together forever. God never goes back on a covenant. And then in chapters 25 to 31, we have the fact that God is now going to live among them. And therefore he needs a place to live. He needs a tent. But he needs a rather different tent from theirs, or they might think he's just one of them. And so we have the specification of the tabernacle. And God provides specialists, people who've never made anything but bricks up till now. And now they've got to work with gold and silver and wood. And God had to teach them those skills. And the Holy Spirit gave those skills to people who'd never made anything but bricks before. That's a miracle. And then comes the saddest part of Exodus, the story of the golden calf when they indulged themselves, and Moses had to pray most earnestly on their behalf, or they'd have never got anywhere further. And finally, the book of Exodus finishes with the construction of the tabernacle, its erection, and God takes up residence, and the glory comes down on his tent. In Hebrew, this book is called These Are the Names. That's because it is read every year in the synagogue, as all the 5 books of Moses are, and it's read, of course, on a rolled-up scroll. And the first words of the scroll are, these are the names. And that's how they named all the 5 books of Moses, by the first words, so you could unroll them in the synagogue and get the right one. But when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, they gave it a different name. They used 2 Greek words, ex, which means out, and hodos, which means way. I don't know if Hoddesdon, the place down the road, is connected with that or not. But ex hodos means out way. And you would have seen it in the Greek theatre, where over at that door you can see the word exit. That's a Latin word, exit. The Greek word would be ex hodos, or way out. And so this book was called The Way Out, the ex hodos. And it's just been slightly corrupted in English to Exodus. And that's why we call it Exodus. But I'm sure you realized it was The Way Out. It sounds too like exit. Right, well, let's look at the first half of Exodus in this talk, chapters 1 to 18. There are many so-called problems in this first half. It is so obvious an unnatural story. This kind of thing doesn't happen every Tuesday. And when you read through one thing after another, makes you wonder at times, did this really happen? And there are plenty of people to tell us it didn't, and that we're reading about legends and myths. There was a series on television not long ago which took that line and tried to tell us that there were a whole lot of legends gathered around the beginnings of the Israelite history. Well, is it myth or miracle? Why are there these problems? Well, the first reason is that there's no secular record of these events. Outside of the Bible, there is no trace whatever of any of this in any Egyptian records, for example. Now, that is astonishing because they did keep pretty good records. And that's one of the reasons that people say, oh, this must be legend. Well, I can think of a jolly good reason why the Egyptians didn't record this. Can you? Yes, you've seen it already. I'm quite sure they didn't want to record for posterity such a humiliating experience as seeing their best chariots and charioteers drowned in the Red Sea. They didn't want to be humiliated. So I'm not troubled by the fact that there is no other record. The numbers involved create a problem for other people. 2.5 million. I mean, that's a huge number. If they marched 5 abreast, I suppose the column would be about 110 miles long. And would take, months to pass. It is an enormous number. 2.5 million. Men, women and children. To say nothing of all their animals. And we're told even some Egyptians came with them. That's an interesting little point. So that's a big number to get through the desert for 40 years, where there's no food or water normally. So the numbers create a problem for some. Then there's the problem of the date of it. Because we have no other record outside the Bible, we don't know, for example, which pharaoh it was. And therefore we don't know which century it was. And there are 2 possibilities that these scholars look at. One is the 15th century BC and the other is the 13th. If it was the 15th, it was a pharaoh called Thutmose. But if it was the 13th, and to be frank, that's the one I go for, I believe all the evidence points to the 13th century, then it would be this pharaoh, and I've got a picture of him for you, just to show you what an impressive character he was. He even had 4 statues of himself made, not content with 1. He had 4. This is Ramesses II. And you can just see the top of 2 people at the bottom of the picture to show you the size of these monuments. Now, this is what the Israelites were up against. See, we often treat Pharaoh as a little baddie. He wasn't. He was a very powerful emperor. And he had the most powerful military force in the ancient world. A man who could cause those 4 statues to be erected of himself, carved out of the solid mountain. He was no mean character. But in God's sight, he was puny. And it was no problem to God to deal with that man. But I believe you're looking at the likeness of the Pharaoh who was involved in the book of Exodus. Then there is division about the route of the Exodus. And there are 3 possibilities we're going to have to look at. Again, we don't know exactly which route they took. And there are 3 alternatives to consider: north, middle and south. And we'll have to look at those. You see, all these questions have made scholars doubt whether they're reading fact or fiction, or perhaps faction, that modern mixture of fact and fiction which we're now accustomed to with TV historical plays. Well, it does boil down to faith. And my faith says the most understandable explanation for the facts is the book of Exodus. And the facts are these. First of all, the existence of a nation called Israel. Now, nobody can dispute there is a nation called Israel in the world today. Where did they come from? How did they get started? How did they ever become a nation if they were actually a bunch of slaves? We do know that from secular records, that they were a bunch of slaves. Something dramatic is needed to explain the existence of Israel. Or take another fact. It is a fact that every year, every Jewish family celebrates the Passover. Now that's a fact. Every Jewish family does that. Why do they do it? You've got to have some explanation for such a ritual that has survived for so many thousands of years.